You're listening to the Faith and Work Podcast, where we explore ways to serve God and others in our daily work to bring life and hope to workplaces and cities. Welcome to the Faith and Work Podcast. I'm Joanna Meyer, your host for today, and I serve as Executive Director of Women, Work, and Calling, which is a national initiative of Denver Institute for Faith and Work. I'm excited for today's conversation about purpose, desire, and calling. But before we get started, I have a question for you. What role does desire play in how you discern your calling? It's a tough question, isn't it? Chances are you have maybe heard mixed messages about desire and calling. You may be familiar with a quote from Frederick Buechner, who said, "The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." That can be an inspiring phrase, or also can be kind of paralyzing because you're thinking, like, I have to earn a living. How do I match deep gladness and the world's deep hunger? Or you may believe that desire is a less trustworthy guide than God's will as it's revealed through scripture or prayer. Understanding the interplay between purpose and desire can be super confusing, and how we regard these vital components of calling plays a profound role in how we integrate our experience of God in our work. Today's guest, author, consultant, and coach Tracey Gee, has helped hundreds of individuals and organizations find their way through this very confusion, and I cannot wait for you to hear from her. In addition to her work as a consultant and coach, Tracey Gee is the author of The Magic of Knowing What You Want, a practical guide to unearthing the wisdom of your desires. She began her career as a senior leader in a major college ministry, and in her current work, she has served organizations as diverse as the National Basketball Association, Coca-Cola, UC Berkeley, Amazon, and the Miami Heat. And I'm thrilled to announce that she will be one of the keynote speakers at the Women, Work, and Calling 2025 event in November. Welcome, Tracey.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it is an absolute delight both reading your book and getting to know you in the process of determining if you'd be a good fit for our event. So thanks for being part of this conversation with us today. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a story behind the bio that we just read. So after decades of working in campus ministry with students and with student leaders, you made a big jump into coaching and consulting. And I'm wondering if you could tell us about that transition and how it shaped the concepts in your book.
Mm-hmm. When you put it like that, it sounds so lovely and so thoughtful. The reality of it was a lot messier, a lot more emotional. I tell a bit of this story in the book that I'd worked, for decades for an organization, went up for a big promotion and sort of had it, pinned as this is my dream job. I'm really excited about this. Did not get it. And I was devastated. So that left me in a place of confusion and asking questions I never thought I'd be asking at that stage in my journey. I sort of thought I had, things well mapped out, and the reality was quite different. I remember when my husband told me, I've never seen you like this, in that period of time when I was just disappointed and struggling and didn't know which way was up in, my faith and my leadership and my sense of calling, all of the above. It really felt like it got turned upside down. And I know, people don't get promotions all the time. It's not always that deep. But at that point in my journey, at that juncture, it really did go to that place for me. So it was through that soul searching and prayer and all the wrestling that I feel like I kind of got reformed, and a different version of my leadership as I understood it got birthed. But it took a lot of questions, a lot of not knowing, a lot of trying, a lot of the things that I'm presenting this book. I share about it because it's things that I do with other people, but really I started with myself, and it started with that period of time when I made that mid-career jump that, again, I never imagined that I would need to do, but it ended up being one of the most formative and generative times. And I think not only in my work, but also just in my personhood.
Yeah. And that first big career disappointment hits at different ages in people's lives, and it can be especially powerful if you've had a lot of success or if doors have opened for you up to a certain point, and that first real closed door can just shake your identity because you're used to succeeding and moving forward. So I can definitely Appreciate that. You know, at the Denver Institute and when we're calling, the concept of calling is just central to what we talk about, the idea that our lives are lived in response to God, but it also can be very confusing. And so before we get too far into our conversation, I wanted to get a chance for our listeners to clarify, what are we talking about when we talk about calling? And I'd love to know how you would describe it for a person of faith that you might be coaching.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's an often quoted Frederick Buechner quote about our calling is a place where our deep gladness meets the world's needs. And we were messaging about that quote a little bit. It's so popular because I think it's really profound and it resonates with so much. And I think partially why it is so meaningful and impactful is because he's presenting this idea of deep gladness, which is a little unexpected and refreshing. And there's something really moving about that we connect to. But I think for a lot of us as believers, it's hard to recognize that deep gladness in our lives. Sometimes it feels a lot easier to identify the world's needs and here's the problems that need to be fixed. And here's all the things that need to be changed in our world. That's very front and center in our faces. But knowing how we can uniquely contribute to that in a way that fits our deep gladness and our joy and a sense of who we've been made to be by God, I think that's a little harder. Yeah. And so I think that's what the conversation, I really like that conversation about trying to figure out what is that intersection truly and how is that very unique and individualized for each person based on, again, how God has made us to image him in a million different ways. And so it's that creativity and that intersection that I find fascinating.
That's one thing I've so appreciated about your work is that, on the other end of the spectrum of how we see desire, I think sometimes we can picture that calling is this uber special thing that God has for us and he'll reveal it. And it's like magic from the Lord about what you're supposed to do in life. And when that doesn't happen, we think like, oh, I'm totally lost. And what I like about your book is it situates us somewhere in the middle of like being entrepreneurial about our lives and seeking and having questions. So you actually do find out what's delightful in the context of your actual real life, not this imagined vision of what God has for you. And that's a beautiful skill, I think, for a person of faith to have is like, how do I take this sense of who God has made me to be and match it to the reality of where I actually am? So I found that to be very life-giving. One thing that actually challenged me a lot in your work is that you talk about the intersection of purpose and desire. And that's one thing we've asked you to speak to at Women Work in Calling. You write, it seems to me that the idea of desire sets off inner alarm bells, but the topic of purpose never does. And I'm wondering if you would elaborate on that a little bit.
For sure. Yeah, it's fascinating to see, I think particularly in faith context, that word desire, it evokes a lot. Mm-hmm. I've had people say to me like, whoa, that made me feel really uncomfortable. That made me uneasy. I did not like this. Like, I felt very unsettled by you even using that word. And that's a little bit by design. I use that word on purpose because I think it gets to something that feels real. Mm-hmm. You can't fake desire. You can't really be up in your head about it. It has to come, like you said, from a place of what is real in your life, what is actually true of who you are versus a lofty, imagined vision. And there's a time and a place for that kind of creativity and engagement, of course. But I think the word desire is just something you can't fake that. And I think the more that we lean into that word, it invites us to listen to ourselves and listen to our lives and ultimately listen to God in a way that is authentic and honest. And it might not be where you end up, but it gets you to start to that place of like, what's really true about who you are and what's meaningful to you. And I think it also pushes us not to engage with self-judgment. Mm-hmm. I think particularly for folks that are used to putting others before themselves, like a lot of us women do, mm-hmm. It's so easy to treat our own desires with a lot of harshness. And I think what I'm trying to present in the book is an invitation to say, what if you didn't do that to yourself so much? What if you didn't put all that judgment or critique and criticism and harshness on what you are sensing? Because I think God is in that place. That's the God that I see in scripture. I think about John 1 a lot. I reference it very briefly in my book, but when Jesus, the book of John is so interesting because you have this prologue that's cosmic and huge, and the word was flesh and dwelt among, and then you have John the Baptist, and you have people talking about Jesus, like, what's he about? What's he really doing? But the first time that Jesus speaks in that book, he says, what do you want? And he invites this question, and he invites this honesty and conversation. And I just love that. I'm always so intrigued by that, why that's his approach. And he wants to engage with this question. But for us, a lot of times we're like, no, we can't ask that. That's not okay. That's not allowed. We can only think about what other people need and want from us. And so I just think that word, it brings us to a place of honesty with God, which I think is always going to be a good thing.
I want to echo what you said, that in the book of John, the first words that Christ is recorded to have said are, what do you want? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a beautiful reality of calling, is that calling is a whole life invitation to follow God. And that means all of our life. So purpose and desire have this dance within us as we discern what it looks like to follow God. And that's a powerful and a risky invitation to sit with both. I want to read a quote from your writing, because you are a great writer and it will inform our conversation. You say, our desires have something important to say. They shake things up in profoundly generative ways to help us create what the world needs. The more I work with people coming alive to who they are, the stronger my hunch is that our desires have a central role to play in us, and the world is waiting to welcome the beautiful work our desires are capable of. If that doesn't convince our listeners to buy your book, I don't know what will. So I want to dig into a little bit more about that piece on Christian women. And men, if you're listening, keep listening, because this may apply to you too. But I know from having interacted with hundreds of Christian women that in some spaces, certainly not all, but in some, men's desires can be seen as visionary and forward-looking, but women's may not be given such a generous interpretation. I'm curious why you think that is.
I think there's just, again, a lot of ways that women are, in a really wonderful way, thinking collectively, thinking about the whole, not wanting to just think about themselves. I talk to so many women that are like, oh, I don't want to be selfish. I don't want to be a selfish person. Of course. But then in the name of that, go to the complete opposite direction, where it's almost a self-forgetfulness and a self-erasure. And again, I think it's out of a great value, a great heart to say, I want to show up for other people. I want to show up in the world and make an impact that's positive. And of course, that's so wonderful. Of course, that reflects the heart of God. But I think in that, I often think that women, they don't do for themselves what they so willingly do for other people. They can interact with a friend and say, well, of course you should ask these questions and think about yourself and pursue some of your ideas and passions. But when it comes to themselves, no, I could never do that. That's wrong. That's selfish. Whereas I just think the men that I work with don't seem to have that problem as much. There's a homework assignment I give in a reflection exercise in the book that's about, name 100 things that you want, because it's meant to just give space and permission, and took a closer look at what these things are. And I noticed, again, not solely, like you said, it's not everyone, but for a lot of the women that can be, ooh, that's challenging, or I don't think about that, or I can't remember last time I even asked myself that question. And again, this is very broad generalizations, but I remember the time I was coaching a man, and he was like, okay, great. Yeah, that sounds fun. I'm going to go do that. And I come back and here's what I thought about. And, sort of was more matter of fact, more straightforward. And I just think in general, men tend to experience a little bit more inner permission to ask these things, and to trust that it's going to lead to something good, and trust that it's going to lead to a place of being positive for other people, or making, things more clear as to what God might be saying in your life. But I think women tend to make that disconnect much sharper, and therefore create sort of a barrier to think about that for themselves.
I think that plays out in work a lot. I mean, I know a lot of Christian women who are very high achieving in work, but if they've never been rooted in a foundation of like a biblical vision of vocation and God going with them, the level of compartmentalization is pretty profound. Or if you haven't seen examples of women who are honoring God and leading in the workplace, it can just the absence of examples can be paralyzing. And so that desire, that ambition you have is not matched to the models that have been set for you. And that can hold you back from really stepping into that. So lots of factors why we may not lean into the desires that we have. I'd like to know what the consequences are of not wrestling with desire. Because I think you've probably sat with a lot of people that are pretty shut down, but like, what have you seen?
I think that when people are disconnected from this part of how God has made them, I think it leads to a lot of negative things holistically. So you talk about kind of whole life engagement with God, but so I don't think it just ends up showing up in your work life or your sense of calling, though, of course, I think that becomes a barrier. I love the book by Parker Palmer called Let Your Life Speak. And he uses an example of his own life of how, he had this, I think, an invitation to become a president of a seminary or a college. I forget the exact context, but, when he sort of dove into that a little bit more, he was like, I think the only reason I want it is because I like that title. But when I look at my life, there's nothing in my life that wants to actually do that role. And so I think when we don't examine our desires, it puts us in those places where, again, it comes out of I think I should want this, or I think this seems like the right thing to do, but it doesn't actually match who we are. And he makes such a great case for needing to examine the reality of our lives before we can try to find that direction, which I just love. And so I think it does lead to profound disconnection in our sense of calling. But then I think beyond that, just our whole life, I see a lot of other things. I was just looking at an article where it was talking about how, I think it was looking particularly at women, but women who have trouble with this, it shows up in health problems.
Yeah.
It shows up, in our bodies. And I do think that ultimately then all of it has impacts on the kind of, parents we are, the kind of lives we're leading, just how we image that. So pretty much every aspect of our lives, like I said, even down to our physical health. Mm-hmm. There was a story too that I remember the author, Elizabeth Gilbert, she used to have a podcast and she interviewed a woman on there who was talking about how she pursued a love and an interest of comedy, but she didn't think that was, like worthy enough. And I don't even know if she was a believer, but she sort of shut it down because like, oh, that doesn't seem, serious. That doesn't seem like a good thing to give your life to. And so instead she went in the whole other direction and she became a scholar of, I think, the Holocaust.
Oh my.
Yeah. And like did a PhD and which was like, okay, that is like wildly different. But it came back to her where her hair started falling out. Her health was terrible, all kinds of things in her life where basically her body was telling her, this is not you. This is not who you are. And you trying to sort of put yourself as a like square peg in a round hole. It's eating away at your body and soul. Yeah. And so I think there's actually a lot of things that happen, but it can be subtle. And, the thing I desperately want is for us to not have to get to that point. Like, let's not get to that point where your health is failing you and your hair is falling out, for you to be able to pay attention to these things. Like, could we begin to have conversations and dialogue about some of these things in ways that will set us on that path moving forward?
Yeah, I think it puts you into a deeper posture of prayer and discernment with the Lord because you're cueing into your spirit and your heart and bringing those to the Lord and saying, what do I do with this? And the profound difference, I even think about good opportunities, the difference between saying, I should do this versus I want to do this. This is an expression of how God is working in me. And I have a feeling that, there are listeners who have made the should decision, like this is the right thing to do, but it may not resonate with who God is and how God's moving in their lives. So desire is a critical like bellwether in that process.
I couldn't agree more. I think that the I should and the I want, I think that's one of the most important and also hardest sometimes discernment pieces so that you use that word of discernment. I think that's so true, because how do you know when it's the right time is to put yourself out there and go for something or not? And I think it's different in different seasons of our lives too. So I think it takes a lot of discernment, but I know we don't get there any easier if we're like shutting down this part of our lives.
Oh, totally.
Hey, I'm Luke.
And I'm Samantha.
And we're donors to Denver Institute for Faith and Work.
As entrepreneurs, our work can often feel all-consuming. The Denver Institute for Faith and Work has helped us to think both critically and theologically about how our business is impacting our workers and the communities we are a part of.
As Denver Institute pursues its mission to prepare people to serve God and others through their daily work, we look forward to the impact it'll have. This can't happen without the support of this community. If you've been encouraged by this conversation, or if your life has been shaped by Denver Institute, we encourage you to join us in giving to this mission.
To learn more or to make a financial gift, please visit the Give page at denverinstitute.org.
Okay, so here's the $1 million question that I want to focus the last half of our conversation on is like, how do we actually do this? And one of the things that I've loved in your book is that you actually make it practical. And it's not like some abstract skills assessment where you're getting a report back that says you should be a mortician, but you invite us into some very practical questions and exercises that are doable in the context of our daily lives. It's astonishing how practical they are. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And so tell me a little bit about how we actually start identifying our desires. That seems like, that's a big question, but like, how do we get started in small ways?
That's right. Well, thank you for saying that. That means a lot to me, because that was very important to me, because this work, like, as I said, it began with me. And then I started finding people coming to me saying, I don't know what I want next. I'm in a transition. And I was like, well, I can tell you some things that helped me. Let's do this process together. And then I noticed over time, the more that started happening, the more the things I was recommending were the same. And I was like, oh, there's some commonalities to the kinds of thinking and conversations that seem to lead to better clarity. Let me take a look at that. And that's basically how, what I recommend in the book was born. I think one place to start that can be a helpful entry point is just thinking about this idea of the kinds of questions you ask yourself and looking at that a little bit more closely. Because I find for folks, especially if that feels new or feels a little bit scary or risky, to think about, like, what do I really want? That can be a really overwhelming question. And, again, part of why I wrote the book is that I felt like there is a lot of asking of that in certain types of, leadership or personal growth and personal development type things. But I didn't see a lot about that could help folks that felt like, I asked that and I'm so confused. I have no idea where to start. So I became intrigued listening to lots of people start to process this. And I noticed that when you ask yourself, what do I want? Usually what happens is that you start asking then 60 other questions. Like, okay, what do I want? Yeah, but is that really possible? Or if I could do that, could I pull that off? Like, I don't know if anyone would actually hire me. Does that exist? I don't know if I can afford that. I don't know. Am I allowed to ask this? Am I allowed to want this? So then not only were you trying to ask, again, this question that I think is really sacred and really central, but then we get sort of hijacked by millions of other questions that quickly pile on top of it. And those are questions often, not always, but often rooted in some fear, some anxiety, some uncertainty, right? All of the above. And then we're overwhelmed and we don't know what to do with that. So of course, it makes sense that it feels confusing. It feels hard to do. So one practical thing that I like to help people do at the beginning of a process like this is to say, look, let's just look at these questions to begin with. What kinds of questions are they? They tend to follow a certain pattern. There's competency-based questions that are about, what are you capable of? There's pragmatic questions that are all about, is this realistic or not? Capitalistic questions about, is this affordable? What are the finances? And then permission questions like, is this even okay? Like, am I allowed to even say that I want this? And even just that act of being more conscious about the questions that you're asking and identifying those it tends to, I find, bring it from that place of fear and anxiety and helps it come to that part of ourselves that can be a little bit more intentional, a little bit more creative, a little bit more like, okay, let's just think about this. So one thing that I always do with folks that are in that more confused place is just do a question dump. I think in the book, I call it a question parking lot. Write down every question that you think of that comes to mind. Let it just live on a piece of paper rather than swirling around in your head. And that alone sometimes can help clarify. I've had so many people say, oh, no wonder I feel so confused. Like, look at the millions of things I'm trying to process at the same time. Of course, this is overwhelming. And I try to help people also differentiate which are the primary questions, which are the ones that deserve your first and primary attention, and which ones can wait a little bit. So I think questions about who are you, what lights you up, what makes you come alive, what do you genuinely want and long for, those I would call primary questions. And secondary questions tend to be, like I said, those questions of permission or pragmatics or practicals. And those are not important. I'm not one of those people that's like, no, never think about those things. But I find that we're usually a little too quick to ask those questions. And most folks are helped by saying like, okay, we're going to let these live on the side. I know they're there. I can come back to them, but we're going to park them because if you let those kinds of questions drive your inquiry and your process, I find that it's really hard to make any headway and it quickly becomes overwhelming. So I'm just saying like, okay, you can have those questions. It's okay. That's normal. That's human. But we're going to park them and we're going to focus on some primary questions first. And we can come back to it later. And usually I find that then brings a kind of groundedness to the process and a listening and discernment. And then you can put some of them back in. Maybe not even all of them. Maybe you don't even need all of them. Usually that's the case. There's usually too many. But you can put some back in about, okay, well, what's the smart way to approach this? Or how do I consider my financial situation as I begin to explore? There's ways to do that. And I'm a big fan of that, but it's not too early, not too soon.
Those important real world questions need to be addressed eventually, but they'll shut the process down if you put them at the front of your thought and discernment process. And so, like you said, just allowing them to sit off to the side while you just sit with your own desires and with the Lord on like, how do I deal with this? What advice would you have for someone who, I can picture someone having a blank sheet of paper or their journal open and trying to say, what do I desire? And not having anything come out, or what comes out feels very like small and not actionable. Like, how do you actually begin getting that process of imagining and thinking about what your heart wants? How do you begin that?
Mm-hmm. So many thoughts. I'll try to limit myself. Well, two things I would say off the bat. One is and this is where I do start kind of this process with a lot of people, is looking at your past, looking at the things that have come up in your past experiences that were you at your best, you feeling alive, you feeling engaged with who you are and with God and with others, and looking for, I call it in the book, peak experiences. So these times when you felt like, oh, that was really great. And people who know Ignatian spirituality, know the Examen, it's very much in that line of thought, which I'm a huge fan of. So one is, I think, beginning to that, what I find that does for folks is it helps, again, just pay attention to who you truly are and what has already shown up in your life, because God has already shown up and shown you some of what it looks like when you're living in that place of desire and purpose. And again, the way that is unique to you. Oops. The second thing I would say is sometimes it can be helpful just to go with it and take that blank sheet of paper. Again, one of the exercises that I talk in the book is write down 100 things that you want. Don't edit yourself. They can be small. They can be not small. They can be, totally unrealistic. They can be something you could do in 5 minutes, but the point of that is to go against the normal energy that we have. So usually it's like, ooh, what do I want? I'm going to try to make that really, really small. Really, I don't want to inconvenience anything or anyone with this. I'm just going to make it teensy tiny.
What can I squeeze into my real life as it is?
That's right. Let's shrink it. And instead, this is like, let's go wide open, because most people are not running around thinking about 100 things that they want and giving themselves permission to do that. And the number itself is like, whoa, that's way more than I usually think about. So it's not a magic number. Like sometimes I have folks come back to me and say, well, I could only get to 40. Is that okay? Like, yeah, that's fine.
Better than when you were at 0.
Exactly. And it's just exercising that muscle, right? I've had people say things as small to me as like, I want to eat more tacos. I want to learn to ride a skateboard. I want to, okay, great. It doesn't have to jump through the hoops of like, is this profound? Is this okay? Like, again, it's just a way to practice. It's just a way to flex a muscle that maybe has gotten a little ignored. So, if you go to the gym and you're like, oh, okay, I'm trying to work out in the first time in a long time, it's like that. You're like, okay, I'm just going to get out there, put in some reps, practice. And I find that it just helps awaken that part of us. And I often find people will say things like, and then I was kind of surprised at a couple of things I wrote. I didn't realize I wanted that. Yeah. So, the author, Emily P. Freeman, she talks about like, you want what you want, whether or not you admit it. So this is an exercise. I'm like, let's just take a little inventory. Let's take a stroll through this and look at that together with God and see what's there. And I find that can be just a more playful, low stakes way to engage with a question like this.
Even something like, I want a job where my boss doesn't expect me to monitor my email all weekend may sound like it's a very superficial thing. And yet just acknowledging that can create movement. And it's telling for what you want in your next job or something like that. So
not superficial at all. So that's one thing you're not allowed to do in that exercise, is call anything frivolous or superficial or too small. All of it's valid. Yeah. And, some of it may or may not be eventually with your discernment, but I think it goes to like, do we trust that like if there are things that show up on there that aren't ultimately good for us, that God wouldn't be able to talk to us about that and redirect us? Like, isn't God big enough for that? But we try to do all that ahead of time, and then it's not helpful.
Mm. Part of being open to desires and being able to bring them into our life and to the Lord is that you have to be open to disappointment. And I think one of the things that can kill our ability to be hopeful, forward-looking, creative, or generative about our lives is that we have disappointment that shouts loudly. How would you counsel someone for whom disappointment is a strong voice in their life that would keep them from being imaginative or hopeful about future choices?
Absolutely. That's such a great question, because I think I've heard it over and over again, like, I don't want to open this up because what if I get disappointed? Like, wouldn't that be the worst thing in the world? I don't even want to come close to that. So I'm not even going to ask the question. And so, I'm sure we've all heard a version of that too. So this is not uncommon. It's a very strong pull. And in some sense, I get it, because disappointment is really hard. I shared a little bit about my story. That's ultimately what was at the heart of it. I was really disappointed. Really, really wanted it, huge high of like, I think this is really what I want, to the deep low of, that's not going to happen. That's really painful. So I'm not trying to minimize that or say that that isn't hard. I get it. I've been there. I know how much that can really hurt. But what I want to say to folks also is that there are worse things than being disappointed. And if you know how to listen to disappointment, and you know how to work within it and engage in it with God, it can actually really help us get closer to what we want rather than further away. So I think I mentioned this in the book. I talked with a mentor after I didn't get the job, and he was like, write down all the things you wanted about that job specifically. Be very specific. So not just that you wanted the job, name what you wanted to do in it. Yeah. And so then I was like, okay, well, I think I'm kind of bored in my current job, so I want a new challenge. I want to feel like I don't know what I'm doing and I have to ask a million questions. I want to be in that learning phase where I feel like I have to activate that part of myself. I want to work with leaders in a new way. I want, a broader scope for my thinking. There, I made a list of like the detailed specific things. And that was so helpful because it helped me see that the desires that I had within that job were a separate entity from the job itself. In my mind, they were one and the same, right? The job is the only way to get these things that I want. And that reflection helped me realize these are actually two different things. I thought this might be the means to the desires that I see in my life. Actually, it's just one avenue. And oh my goodness, there are 25 other ones that if I can have some openness and creativity, and like, I love that you use that word entrepreneurial, a little bit of that entrepreneurial spirit with it. Who knows where this could go? Now, it wasn't as sure, it wasn't as concrete as the job, but it was no less real. And so I always like to encourage people to say, disappointment, yes, it's terrible, but if you don't let the conversation end there, it can actually get you so much closer to those true desires and help you figure out what was the real thing and what was just a means to an end. And it helps you learn how to reroute and move forward. And I just think it's it's like, there's like one thing I could like magically gift everybody listening would be the ability, the skills to know how to do that, because I think it is something that so easily shuts us down.
To wrap up our conversation, well, one, we're going to get to hear more of you at Women Work in Calling in November, which is exciting. But I'm wondering if we could close our conversation rooting it back in Scripture. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. I'm just wondering, for our listeners, could you direct us back to a passage or reference in Scripture that would just be something we could sit with the Lord with our desires?
Love it. Well, one of the parables that I love most is when Jesus talks about the treasure in the field. And the pearl of great price, how, there's these two parallel parables that talk about, the person selling or buying the whole field in order to get the treasure that's hidden in it. And, often we talk about these parables as an analogy of the gospel, how worthy the gospel is. And I think that's definitely true. But I have, for the last 10 years or so, just been fascinated with thinking about it from this perspective of our lives and, again, how God has made us. And I think that each of us has treasure hidden in our lives if we know, and if we can build the curiosity to go looking for it, to ask those questions, like God will reveal that. So I love that image of thinking about, in the whole of our lives, in our experiences, and again, who we've been made to be, God has these nuggets of gold, these pearls, this treasure, and we then get to have the invitation to search for it and to do a little digging and to try to figure out, where is this treasure hiding? Because it's there, but if we don't ever ask or look, I think we really miss out. So I find it really just a great invitation, I think, to examine our lives and to look for the treasure that God has put in each of us.
It's so beautiful. Tracey, I can't wait to keep learning with you. And I want to close our conversation today with a quote from your book, because it just sings and it really captures the spirit of what we dream of for people in the Denver Institute and Women Work in Calling communities. It says, with our world so desperate for healing and transformation, maybe the individuals and communities who can make a difference in the tangle of crisis and opportunity are precisely the kinds that need the power of both purpose and desire in their lives. And what a benediction. We can ask that the Lord would do that work in our own life. So thanks for your wisdom, and I can't wait to learn more.
so lovely to connect with you, Joanna. Thank you for having me.
Thanks to Tracey Gee for this conversation. I want to encourage you, if you were intrigued by what she said, get a ticket for Women, Work, and Calling 2025. It is Friday, November 7th. We'll be offering it in person here in Denver, Colorado, but also at 20 plus host sites around the country and online for individual viewers. You may want to buy Tracey's book, The Magic of Knowing What You Want, which we'll link to in our show notes. And we will also link to 2 resources from Denver Institute. One is a digital discussion guide, Women, Work, and Calling, produced this year, called Getting Clear About Calling. And also we'll link to 2 other episodes of the Faith and Work podcast about what does it mean to be called. These were life-changing episodes that clarified a lot of confusion that I had about calling. And so we want to make sure that you get a chance to hear from seminary professors who really are unpacking scripture on these themes. Thanks for joining us today. I pray that our conversation has ignited new imagination for you in your work and calling. If you've enjoyed this episode of the Faith and Work podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, or share it with a friend. The Faith and Work podcast is produced by Denver Institute. We believe that when Christians work faithfully, the world will taste the hope and life that Jesus provides. To learn more or to make a financial contribution, visit denverinstitute.org.